In the heart of a Colorado winter, where the mountains stand like ancient guardians and the snow falls thick enough to erase every footprint, a single mother bursts into a quiet police station with fear trembling in her voice. Her son has vanished into the storm. No clues, no witnesses, only a trail of white swallowed by the night. But what begins as a desperate search soon unravels into a secret long buried beneath the ice, a chase through frozen forests, and a bond between a brave officer and his loyal K-9 that will be tested by the storm itself. Before we begin this journey through courage, danger, and the quiet miracles hidden in the snow, tell me where in the world you are watching from. Leave a comment to let me know how far this story travels. Snow fell over Silver Ridge in thick, whispering sheets, so heavy it blurred the sharp outlines of the mountains and softened the quiet streets into pale, ghost-like ribbons. This small mountain town, perched high in Colorado's northern range, lived through winters that felt less like a season and more like a trial carved by the wind itself. On that night, the storm had swallowed nearly everything. The neon signs on Main Street flickered behind curtains of white. The rooftops sagged under their frosted weight, and the pines around the outskirts bowed as if in prayer. But inside the police station, a squat brick building warmed by humming radiators and the smell of burnt coffee, chaos burst through the front doors. Sienna Moore stumbled inside, with snow tangled in her auburn hair and her breath slicing out in short, frantic bursts. She was 32, tall but slender, with the kind of exhausted grace that came from carrying too many responsibilities alone. Motherhood had shaped her posture into a constant forward lean, as if she was always ready to shield her son from the next blow life might throw. Her face, pale under the fluorescent lights, carried the gentle softness of someone who loved too deeply and worried too often. The shadows beneath her eyes belonged to someone who had been shaped by grief. Losing her husband Jackson 3 years earlier had carved a quiet courage into her, but also left her wary, hesitant, quick to assume danger where others might not see it. Sienna's voice trembled as she pressed her hands to the front desk, barely forming the words. "My son, my little boy Tommy, they took him." The officer nearest the desk looked up from his paperwork, startled. Officer Grant Mallory, early 40s, rugged face, a polite but somewhat detached manner, rose quickly. Grant was the kind of man who worked best with routine. Parking violations, noise complaints, the occasional bar fight, anything outside that realm usually made him uneasy, but even he recognized terror when he saw it flooding from a mother's eyes. Before Grant could speak, footsteps echoed from the hallway. Officer Caleb Ward strode into the room with the calm but alert posture of someone who understood emergencies instinctively. Caleb was 36, broad-shouldered, with dark hair cropped close and a faint scar just above his right brow, a remnant of a rescue mission years ago. He carried himself with steady confidence, but there was a quiet loneliness in him too, the kind that settles into someone who has spent too many years running toward danger while the rest of the world ran away. Despite his firm exterior, Caleb was known in Silver Ridge for treating victims gently, especially children. Stories of him kneeling so he'd meet a frightened kid at eye level circulated like small folklore in the town. At his side padded Ranger, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a thick winter coat the color of burnt oak. Ranger was a seasoned K-9, muscular but agile, his amber eyes sharp and intelligent. Despite his discipline, Ranger carried an almost noble warmth, as if he had accepted the town as his personal responsibility to guard. He had served with Caleb for 3 years and was known for his unmatched tracking ability and an uncanny sense for danger. Citizens often said Ranger behaved less like a dog and more like a soldier who had chosen Caleb as his one true companion. Caleb reached Sienna first. "Take a breath," he said gently, his voice steady enough to anchor her panic. "Start from the beginning. What happened to Tommy?" Tommy Moore, 10 years old, was known around town as a bright, curious child with a mop of unruly brown hair and a laugh that echoed like a bell through the grocery aisles whenever Sienna took him shopping. He was small for his age, with a habit of clutching his backpack straps when nervous, and an endless fascination with model airplanes. He was polite, sometimes shy, but carried a quiet bravery inherited from his parents. Through shaking breaths, Sienna managed to explain, "I was inside the house. Just a minute. Just 1 minute to put the kettle on. Tommy was on the porch with his winter jacket. Then I heard tires, fast, and when I ran out, he was gone. She swallowed hard. A man grabbed him. Caleb motioned her to follow him into the operations room, an open space lined with screens and glowing monitors. Snow pounded the windows, the wind howling like something ancient outside. He sat Sienna down, offered her a blanket someone grabbed from the supply closet, and turned his attention to the nearest screen. Ranger sat beside him, ears pricked. "Did you see the vehicle?" Caleb asked. Sienna nodded shakily. "Black truck, big, maybe lifted. The plates were covered." Her hand trembled as she pressed it to her chest. "Then I got a call." Caleb froze. "What did they say?" "That my son is the last debt. The last debt my husband owed." Caleb's jaw tightened. Jackson Moore had been a quiet man when alive, working odd jobs, repairing snowmobiles and fishing gear for locals. Everyone had liked him, but after his death, whispers surfaced. Rumors he had once been forced into helping dangerous people transport illicit goods across state lines. Nothing ever confirmed, nothing ever proven. Yet tonight, those shadows clawed back into Sienna's life. Caleb exchanged a look with Grant, then turned back to Sienna. "We'll find him, I promise." Ranger let out a low, focused whine. He had picked up on the thick fear in the room, the tension vibrating through the air. Caleb gently took from Sienna the small scarf Tommy always wore, navy blue with frayed ends. "Ranger needs his scent." Sienna held the scarf to her face for a moment, fighting back tears before handing it over. Ranger leaned forward and inhaled deeply, committing Tommy's scent to memory. The change in him was immediate. Ears sharp, muscles taut, eyes locked in working mode. Caleb and Grant pulled up feeds from the few traffic and business cameras near the outskirts. The storm had limited visibility, but technology did what the human eye couldn't. Reconstructed frames, enhanced shadows, filtered motion. "There!" Caleb pointed. A grainy image showed a tall figure, bundled in a heavy coat, shoving a child into the back of a lifted black truck parked beside the gas station near the highway turnoff. The plate was deliberately taped over. The attacker's size, posture, and the quick, almost military precision of his movements stirred recognition in Caleb's mind. But he didn't voice it, not yet. Ranger barked once, sharply, impatient, ready. "Okay, boy," Caleb murmured. "Let's work." He turned to Sienna. "We're going after them now. The roads will be bad, but we can track the route until the trail gets clearer." Grant stepped closer, concern wrinkling his brow. "You're taking Ranger out in this storm? Visibility is—" Caleb cut him off calmly. "A child is out there. Ranger can track through conditions the rest of us can't." Sienna stood suddenly. "I'm coming with you?" Caleb shook his head gently. "Not tonight. The storm's too dangerous, and we need you here in case they call again. Every detail could matter." Her eyes brimmed with desperation, but she nodded. "Please, find my son." Caleb promised he would. It wasn't bravado, it was something carved deep into his spirit, a vow forged by years of chasing down both criminals and ghosts. Snow lashed sideways as Caleb and Ranger stepped back out into the night. The air burned cold, the storm roaring across the valley like a living beast. Behind them, through the station's glass doors, Sienna clutched the blanket tightly around herself, her face bent in prayer or fear. Maybe both. Caleb crouched beside Ranger. "Find Tommy," he whispered. Ranger lowered his nose to the snow, inhaled, and pulled forward with certainty, his paws carving new tracks through the white. Caleb followed, bracing himself against the wind as the two vanished slowly into the storm. One man and one dog, chasing a vanishing trail of tire tracks and a boy's lingering scent in a world swallowed by winter. Tonight, Silver Ridge held its breath. The storm had not eased by the time Caleb and Ranger carved their way along the snow-buried highway. The mountains of Silver Ridge rose in jagged silhouettes beneath the swirling white, looming like massive guardians keeping watch over the valley. The road itself was a pale ribbon, half vanished beneath drifting snowbanks. Only the faint red glow of Caleb's taillights illuminated the blizzard behind them as he drove slowly, window cracked to listen for anything beyond the roar of wind. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, posture rigid, nose twitching toward the cold air spilling inside. Every breath he drew was a calculation. Every scent sifted, compared, weighed. Caleb Ward had always trusted the German Shepherd's instincts more than most humans. Ranger had a steady, disciplined nature, but in moments like these, he radiated something sharper, an unwavering purpose, as if he knew exactly how much hinged on finding a 10-year-old boy lost in a world of snow. Caleb, meanwhile, kept one hand firm on the wheel, the other tapping absently against his thigh, a rare sign of nerves from a man typically carved from calm. His thoughts churned with pieces of information, names, grudges, and memories he would have preferred to bury. After 20 minutes of slow, deliberate driving, Ranger suddenly let out a low bark and pressed his nose against the window. Caleb squinted through the flurries and saw faint tire impressions, barely visible lines leading off the main road and veering toward the tree line of Northwood Forest. "Good boy," Caleb murmured, pulling over. Northwood Forest was a place residents spoke of with a mix of caution and reverence. It stretched across miles of uneven terrain, thick with pine and clusters of fir that creaked under the weight of winter. The area had once been used by hunters and, decades earlier, rumored smugglers. But now it remained largely untouched, too cold, too wild, too unpredictable. Caleb stepped out, the snow biting instantly at his cheeks. Ranger leapt down beside him, nose lowered to the earth. The tire tracks were shallow, filling quickly with drifting snow, but still there. The storm wasn't strong enough to erase everything. Not yet. Caleb turned on his shoulder radio, though he already knew what would happen. Static crackled uselessly in response. Too far from town. Tower interference from the storm. They were on their own until they found higher ground or a break in the weather. Ranger moved instinctively, pulling forward as he followed the faded impressions. Caleb switched on his flashlight and walked beside him, boots crunching softly beneath the blanket of white. The forest swallowed them within minutes, muffling sound, until only the rhythm of Ranger's pause and Caleb's breath remained. It was in that silence that memories Caleb rarely visited began to surface. Memories painted in desert sand, shouts of command, and a man with a crooked grin who had once stood across from him in a dusty warehouse in Nevada. Oliver Drake. A name Caleb hadn't spoken aloud in nearly 4 years. Oliver had been a smuggler with military training, a man built not just from muscle, but from an unsettling charisma that drew the desperate and the reckless into his orbit. Tall, broad-shouldered, with intense dark eyes that never quite revealed what he was thinking, Oliver had always moved with unsettling precision. But beneath that calm exterior simmered a temper as unpredictable as a fractured minefield. Caleb had crossed paths with him during an operation gone wrong. Shots were fired, arrests were made, and though Oliver had escaped the charges, the humiliation had burned deep. Men like Oliver didn't forget. They plotted, waited, watched. Caleb exhaled slowly as the realization sank deeper into his bones. "Of all nights," he muttered under his breath. Ranger paused at the shift in his tone, but kept tracking. Soon they reached a clearing, where the trees opened into a wide patch of snow-covered ground. Caleb crouched, shining his light. Here, the storm had revealed more than it had hidden. Deep boot prints pitted the snow, large ones, spaced with the stride of someone tall and heavy-set. Caleb studied them, noting the familiar tread, standard military-style soles with a slightly uneven heel. He whispered the name before he could stop himself. Oliver Drake. It has to be. But that wasn't all. Shallow depressions nearby suggested another figure, smaller, lighter. Tommy. The boy had been here. Caleb felt a surge of determination, sharp as the winter air stinging his lungs. He straightened and spoke softly to Ranger. "We're close. Keep going." They continued forward until Ranger suddenly veered right, drawn by something half buried in the snow. Caleb knelt beside him. A spent shell casing glinted faintly beneath a layer of frost. Caleb picked it up carefully. It wasn't fired recently, but the type was unmistakable. Oliver's preferred ammunition from years back. Another breadcrumb on a grim trail. Footprints shifted direction again, leading west toward a break in the trees. Caleb followed, his breath curling into the air like thin smoke. They soon reached a ridge overlooking a narrow service road. The storm had eased only slightly, but visibility improved enough that Caleb could see faint tire tracks heading downhill toward a more secluded section of the forest. A place he knew existed but had rarely visited, the old industrial path leading toward abandoned storage structures near Snowfall Lake. Caleb's voice tightened. That warehouse, he hadn't thought about it in years. The building had once been part of a wartime supply route, later sealed off when it became unstable. But the underground storage tunnels, reinforced and partially forgotten, still ran beneath it. Smugglers had used them decades ago, though the entrances now were almost impossible to spot unless you knew exactly where to look. Oliver would know. Ranger barked once, urging him to continue. Caleb radioed again, still static. The storm might lighten later, but not soon enough to rely on backup. As they descended the ridge, Caleb's flashlight flickered over another piece of evidence, a torn strip of rope lying half buried in the snow. He examined it closely. The fibers were fresh, not weather-worn, likely what had been used to restrain Tommy. His jaw hardened. "He's moving fast," Caleb muttered, "but he's not getting away this time." The rope confirmed one thing. Tommy had not been harmed. Oliver needed leverage, not violence, not yet. That thought brought a sliver of relief to Caleb, though he didn't let himself hold it for long. Ranger sniffed the rope, then turned his head toward the direction of the tracks. He pulled forward with renewed urgency. The forest gradually thinned, giving way to the edge of the frozen lake. Snowfall Lake spread out like a sheet of polished glass beneath the storm clouds, its surface dusted with fresh snow. On the far side of the lake, dark shapes rose from the ground, abandoned storage buildings, their roofs sagging under winter's weight. And there, faint even from a distance, was the unmistakable glint of metal. A vehicle. Oliver's truck. Caleb crouched behind a fallen log, assessing from afar. The truck wasn't moving. Its engine wasn't running. Oliver must have taken Tommy inside one of the old buildings, likely the main warehouse. Large, windowless, perfect for someone who didn't want to be found. Caleb supported one knee on the snow, evaluating possibilities. He couldn't storm the place alone, not without knowing how many accomplices Oliver had brought. But he also couldn't retreat to call for help. The storm was still too strong, and time was slipping. Ranger nudged him softly as though sensing his internal debate. Caleb rested a gloved hand on the dog's neck. "We're not going in blind, just close enough to confirm." They skirted the lake's edge, moving slowly along the tree line until they reached a slight slope leading downward. Their vantage point improved. From here, Caleb could see two figures briefly exiting the warehouse. Silhouettes against the dim security light Oliver must have revived with a generator. He strained his eyes. The smaller figure was ushered inside quickly. Tommy. Alive. Still on his feet. Caleb's heart hammered with controlled relief as he leaned back behind the trees. Ranger pressed against his side, steady and warm. The warehouse door shut again, leaving them in the muffled quiet of falling snow. "We found him," Caleb whispered. "Now we just need to get him out." But even as he spoke those words, Caleb knew what the storm had made painfully clear. Radio signals were useless, roads nearly impassable, and the nearest backup hours away, even in good weather. Tonight, decisions fell on him alone, and Oliver Drake had never been more dangerous than, when cornered, Caleb drew a slow breath, rubbing Ranger's fur. "We wait, boy. We watch, then we move." Ranger's tail thumped once in the snow. Quiet resolve. In the vast frozen stillness, beneath snow swirling like a living veil, Caleb Ward saw the full shape of the battle forming before him, and he did not flinch. The storm had settled into that eerie stillness unique to deep winter nights, when the wind stops just long enough for the silence to pulse like a heartbeat. Snowfall Lake stretched across the darkness like a frozen mirror, reflecting faint constellations behind the drifting clouds. Caleb and Ranger stood at the edge of the tree line, hidden in the shadows as the dim warehouse light flickered across the decrepit structure. The building looked as though it had been sculpted out of frost and forgotten history, corrugated metal walls sagging, wooden beams bowed under decades of neglect, and the faint hum of an old generator barely alive. If the storm had a soul, it seemed to hold its breath with them. Ranger's posture remained sharp, his nose quivering with information carried on the chilled air. He was a creature built for tracking through nature's cruelty. 5 years old in his prime, with every sense honed by training and instinct. Caleb trusted him more than any compass or map. "Easy," Caleb whispered, laying a steadying hand on Ranger's back. The dog's heartbeat thudded beneath his glove, a warm, loyal rhythm against the cold world around them. They stayed hidden, watching the warehouse door for movement. Minutes stretched, slow and heavy. Caleb knew Oliver Drake well enough to assume the man wouldn't linger near the entrance. Oliver preferred the shadows, the angles of a room where he could see without being seen. If Tommy was inside, and Caleb had no doubt now, Oliver would keep him somewhere secure, somewhere he could control. "We need a way in that won't get us spotted," Caleb murmured. The storm had softened the ground into thick, powdery snow. It muted their steps, but also swallowed details that might otherwise guide him. Still, Ranger moved forward with purpose, leading Caleb around the warehouse perimeter. They stayed close to the building's edge, following its jagged outline until they reached the far side, where the snow drifted high against the metal walls. Ranger sniffed the air, then lowered his head toward the ground, tracing something invisible yet undeniable, sent memory like a thin thread connecting Tommy's fear to the world outside. Caleb knelt beside him. "Tommy came through here?" Ranger answered with a brief, soft whine. It wasn't a cry of anxiety, but confirmation. A signal Caleb had learned to read with precision. Caleb scanned the snow carefully. At first, he saw nothing unusual, but as he brushed aside a layer of frost with his glove, he uncovered a faint disturbance, something thin and frayed, a rope fiber. Recent. "Good work," he whispered. Ranger's tail moved once, a restrained flick acknowledging praise while maintaining focus. Caleb pocketed the fiber. It wasn't much, but proof nonetheless that Tommy had been restrained earlier that night. "He's still alive," Caleb said softly, more to steady himself than anything. "And he's not far." Moving around, the side of the warehouse, they found a patch where the snow hadn't settled evenly, subtle depressions that formed a semicircle around an old ventilation grate. Ranger sniffed the grate, his ears lifting. Caleb leaned in. The faintest draft escaped through the metal, carrying distant movement, muffled voices, the scrape of crates being shifted, and footsteps echoing in hollow corridors. Caleb narrowed his eyes. "Below," he muttered. "They're using the tunnels." The underground tunnels, once built during wartime to store emergency supplies, stretched like an abandoned labyrinth beneath this part of the forest. Most entrances had collapsed or been sealed years ago, but a select few remained hidden if you knew where to look. Oliver would have known. He always had a talent for finding forgotten places and turning them into sanctuaries or traps. Ranger shifted and nudged toward the trees just beyond the vent. The dog began pulling slightly on the lead, not urgently, but insistently, as though guiding Caleb toward the next step. Caleb trusted the silent directive. They moved away from the warehouse, circling through the forest until Ranger stopped near a large pine whose roots jutted from the earth like an ancient choir of gnarled hands. Beneath the snow, something metallic glinted. Caleb knelt and brushed it clear. A rusted hatch, half buried but unmistakably an access point to the tunnels. "Well done, boy," Caleb whispered. The hatch resisted at first, groaning with age, but Caleb managed to pry it open just enough to slip inside. A gust of cold air rushed upward, carrying the scent of metal, dust, and something faintly human. Fear, sweat. The echo of footsteps long faded. Ranger descended first, moving with surprising grace for his size, landing softly on the concrete floor below. Caleb followed, flashlight cutting through the darkness to reveal the narrow corridor stretching out in both directions. The walls were lined with old pipes, some dripping faintly, others frozen into cold sculptures where water had once leaked. Shadows clung to the corners like forgotten memories. Yet Ranger moved confidently, nose lowered, following the invisible trail Tommy had left behind. Caleb stayed close, listening, always listening. The tunnels magnified sound strangely, turning each soft echo into something that felt closer than it was. They traveled several yards before Ranger stopped. Ahead, the corridor branched into two paths. Ranger sniffed each one, then looked back at Caleb and nudged the left passage with his muzzle. "That way?" Caleb asked quietly. Ranger confirmed with a low, certain rumble. As they advanced, they heard distant voices drifting down the tunnel. Caleb froze. The words were muffled, indistinct, but he recognized the cadence, the rough, clipped tone of Oliver's men who served out of fear, not loyalty. Their conversation carried fragments about schedules, about waiting until dawn, about moving the kid before the storm worsened. Caleb's jaw tightened. Tommy was alive, still unharmed, but morning would change everything. They crept closer until they reached an old maintenance door whose hinges had rusted into strange shapes. Caleb pressed his ear against it. On the other side, footsteps echoed. Tommy's lighter steps, Oliver's heavier stride, and the shuffling of crates. He could picture the scene without seeing it. He knew Oliver's patterns well. Keep the hostage visible, but restrained. Keep the men nearby, but bored. Keep the getaway vehicle ready. Caleb moved back a few steps and exhaled slowly. "We know where he is now," he whispered to Ranger. "Sunrise is when they'll move. We act before that." Ranger sat beside him, vigilant and silent, a silhouette carved by purpose. They stayed in the tunnel a few minutes longer, mapping the sounds and counting the cadence of movement. Caleb was careful not to push too close. The goal tonight wasn't rescue. That would come soon, but not yet. Tonight was reconnaissance. Identify the layout. Confirm Tommy's safety. Discover Oliver's timing. Ranger nudged Caleb again, this time with a soft, insistent pressure. Caleb understood. "We should go. If they hear us now, we lose the element of surprise." They retraced their steps through the tunnel, emerging back beneath the pine tree. Caleb resealed the hatch, masking their presence beneath snow. Ranger sniffed the bitter night air, double-checking for danger. Satisfied, the dog settled into a quiet stance beside him. Through the trees, the warehouse light flickered, dim but steady. Caleb stared at it with a renewed sense of clarity. Tommy was alive. They had found the hidden access point. The storm had slowed, but dawn would bring its own dangers, visibility for Oliver, and possibly more men arriving. Caleb understood the stakes now, with razor-sharp certainty. "We have the advantage," he murmured, "and we move tonight." Ranger's steady gaze met his, unblinking, loyal, resolute. The storm sighed across Snowfall Lake, as if acknowledging the weight of the night's revelations. Caleb rose, brushing snow from his knees. "We go back," he whispered. "We prepare. Then we come for him." Man and dog turned away from the warehouse, slipping back into the forest shadows. Two figures bound by purpose, walking through a world shaped by winter and danger, readying themselves for the rescue to come. The night thickened over Snowfall Lake like a dark curtain stitched with falling white. The storm had quieted, but only in the way a predator quiets before striking. Its winds no longer howling, only whispering through the pines in low, restless murmurs. The abandoned warehouse crouched against the snowbank, lit by a tired generator that cast pale amber light across rusted panels and icy ground. Inside, shadowed corridors and forgotten rooms held the muffled movements of men who believed the night belonged to them. But beyond the tree line, two figures kept watch. Caleb Ward stood with his back pressed to a frost-covered pine, breath warm against the biting cold. Ranger at his heel like a carved sentinel. The German shepherd was alert, muscles taut beneath his winter coat, every sense attuned to the shifting air around them. Caleb checked his watch. Almost midnight. Dawn was only a few hours away, an hour that would bring danger, movement, and loss if he did nothing. "We go in tonight," he whispered. Ranger exhaled a soft breath, as if confirming the decision. The police radio on Caleb's vest crackled faintly, then went silent again. The storm, with its wall of icy pressure and drifting interference, had reduced communication to nothing but static. Somewhere beyond the mountains, the town slept, unaware of the quiet war forming at the edge of the lake. Caleb tightened his gloves. They couldn't wait for backup. Every instinct, every lesson carved into him from years on the force, told him that once Tommy was moved at sunrise, the trail would vanish into the wilderness. The snow would hide tracks. The mountains would swallow sound. And Oliver Drake would vanish into the dark corners of the world where he always thrived. Caleb couldn't allow that. Not tonight. Not with a child's life in the balance. He crouched beside Ranger, touching the dog's shoulder gently. "This is it, boy. Quiet and fast." Ranger lowered his head, ready. The entrance they had discovered, the hidden tunnel beneath the pine tree, waited behind them, half covered in snow. Caleb brushed aside what the storm had left and lifted the rusted hatch again, careful to keep the noise to a minimum. A gust of cold, stale air rose from the darkness below. Ranger descended first, landing silently on the tunnel floor. Caleb followed, pulling the hatch closed behind them. Darkness swallowed them whole, except for the faint glow of Caleb's flashlight. A thin beam cutting across old concrete, pipes crusted with age, and the long corridor stretching ahead. The tunnel felt colder than the forest above, as if the walls still remembered the chill of wartime storage. Their footsteps echoed softly, muffled by dust and time. Ranger led with confidence born from scent alone, Tommy's faint trail lingering like a thin golden thread in the darkness. As they approached the maintenance door they'd found earlier, an old metal slab corroded by decades of damp air, Caleb paused. "Und." The other side, the warehouse interior hummed with distant movement. Voices floated through the cracks, soft, grumbling, impatient. Men tired of waiting, men who had no idea their safety was about to slip away like snow, dissolving on warm hands. Caleb crouched, angling his ear toward the door. He could distinguish at least two voices. Oliver's men, not Oliver himself. They spoke about the storm, about sunrise, about the kid being moved. "Oliver said we leave at first light," one muttered. "Storm's easing up." "Good, this place gives me the creeps," another replied. The tone wasn't cruel, just cold, practiced, indifferent. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. They were treating the situation like a routine job, as if kidnapping a 10-year-old boy were no different from transporting stolen merchandise. Ranger shifted closer, waiting for direction. "Not through here," Caleb whispered. "Too many eyes." He guided Ranger back down the tunnel, tracing the concrete walls with his fingers, searching for structural irregularities. The warehouse above had been built with multiple chambers, supply rooms, sorting areas, loading platforms, all mostly aligned with the tunnels below. If there was another access point, they could enter without alerting the guards. Ranger suddenly stopped and turned right, nose pressed to the wall. Caleb knelt and brushed away accumulated dust with his hand. Behind it, a faint outline of a door emerged, narrow, metal, once painted red, but faded into the color of old shadow. "There you are," Caleb murmured. He tested the handle, rusted, stiff, but not locked. With slow, steady pressure, he loosened it. The door gave way with a soft groan, quiet enough to blend into the distant hum of the generator. Beyond it lay a narrow stairwell that climbed upward. Cold air drifted through the cracks above, carrying faint sounds. Footsteps, low conversation, and something else. A small sound, barely audible, like a child shifting position. Tommy. The boy wasn't far. Caleb extinguished his flashlight, relying on the faint glow filtering from above. He ascended slowly, Ranger close behind. At the top of the stairs, they reached a narrow hall inside the warehouse. Crates lined the walls, old military boxes stacked like silent soldiers. Frost had formed delicate patterns on their surfaces, as though winter itself had signed its name across them. Caleb motioned for Ranger to stay low. He approached the opening that led to the main chamber. There he saw them, two men seated near a portable heater, their shadows stretching along the concrete. Tommy sat across the room, tied loosely to a chair but unharmed. His head rested against the backrest, eyes moving carefully between his captors. He was scared but conscious. The boy's winter jacket was still on, though dusted with snow. Caleb felt relief wash through him, grounding him for the first time that night. But Oliver was nowhere in sight. That unsettled Caleb. Oliver was a planner, calculated, secretive. If he wasn't here, he was likely preparing the vehicle, the route, the exchange. And that meant time was running out. One of the guards stood, pocketing his gloves. "I'll check the truck," he grumbled, heading toward the warehouse entrance. The other stayed near Tommy, stretching his legs. Caleb slipped behind a stack of crates, thinking. He couldn't confront both men alone. They were armed, alert, and Tommy too close to danger. The plan had to be precise. He retreated silently back into the narrow hall where Ranger waited. The dog's eyes gleamed in the faint light, reading the tension in Caleb's expression. "We go back down," Caleb whispered. "We find a better angle." They descended the stairwell and re-entered the tunnel. Ranger moved forward with renewed determination, guided by Tommy's scent and the layout of the underground passageways. Caleb's mind pieced together a plan. Not a perfect one, but enough. They needed to enter through the opposite side of the warehouse, ideally near the storage corridor, where minimal guard presence was expected. From there, Caleb could reach Tommy without a firefight and slip out through the tunnel with Ranger leading the escape route. But between planning and execution lay danger shaped like frost and shadow. As they advanced deeper, Caleb paused at a junction where the tunnel sloped upward toward another maintenance platform. Ranger sniffed the air and silently pointed his muzzle forward. Caleb followed him up the slope until they reached a grated opening. From here, he could see the underside of the warehouse floor, metal beams, wooden supports, and through the cracks in the planks, faint movement above. Voices drifted downward, Oliver's voice among them, calm, confident, speaking quietly to someone. Caleb strained to hear. "At first light," Oliver said, "we make the exchange. After that, we disappear." Caleb backed away, heart tightening. He needed to move soon. He crouched beside Ranger, pressing his forehead briefly to the dog's. "Tonight, before sunrise, we go in and take the boy home." Ranger's ears lifted, soft but resolute. Something about the dog's presence, rooted, steady, made Caleb feel less alone, less outnumbered, less lost in the storm's shadow. They retreated toward the tunnel's start, emerging once more beneath the pine tree. Snow had fallen again, softer now, settling like a veil over the world. Caleb rose, feeling the weight of the night settle across his shoulders. He stared toward the warehouse, its lights flickering, its shadows shifting. Tommy was inside, alive, waiting, and Oliver stood on the edge of sunrise, holding Sienna's world hostage. But not for long. Caleb rested a hand on Ranger's back. "We're coming for him," he whispered. "Tonight." The storm breathed across the lake like an ancient sigh as the man and his dog prepared for the final move into darkness. The night around Snowfall Lake had hardened into crystal silence, the kind that seems to echo its own breath. The warehouse stood dark against the horizon, its generator humming like a tired heartbeat beneath the storm's thinning veil. Caleb Ward lay hidden in the forest's shadows, Ranger pressed beside him, both watching the faint glow that slipped through cracks in the metal structure. Dawn hovered somewhere beyond the mountains, still distant, yet heavy with promise and threat. They had little time, very little. Caleb touched Ranger's side gently. "This is it," he whispered. "We get him out." The dog's ears lifted, alert and ready. They returned to the hatch beneath the pine tree, descending again into the tunnel system that felt colder and narrower than before. The chill clung to the concrete walls as though the wartime ghosts that once filled these passages still lingered. Ranger led the way, moving quietly, every muscle alert. Caleb kept one hand near his holster, the other trailing lightly across the wall to steady his pace. Near the stairwell leading up to the warehouse's storage hall, Ranger paused. Caleb heard it too, a soft scrape, the distant thud of footsteps. The men inside were restless, pacing, preparing. Perhaps sunrise made them anxious. Perhaps Oliver had given his final instructions. Caleb ascended slowly, staying pressed to the shadows. Through a narrow gap between stacked crates, he saw Tommy, small, bundled in his jacket, seated on the same chair as before, rope still looped loosely around his wrists. His eyes were wide and alert, scanning the room for anything familiar. He looked frightened, yes, but not broken. His spirit had not dimmed. That gave Caleb strength. One of Oliver's men leaned against a crate, cleaning his gloves. The other was closer to Tommy, his expression bored but watchful. And then, fate, with its strange timing, shifted. A metallic click echoed behind Caleb. A breath of surprise. A voice. "Hey, who's there?" Caleb spun. A third guard, one he hadn't seen earlier, stood in the hall behind him, half-shadowed, half-illuminated by the faint lantern light. The man's hand flew toward his weapon. Caleb reacted by instinct alone. "Ranger, down!" The command snapped through the air like a crack of lightning. Gunfire erupted. Not the brutal, violent kind that tears through silence, but sharp, controlled bursts across the metal corridor. Sparks danced briefly where bullets struck steel. Caleb dove behind crates as Ranger slid into cover, instinctively keeping low. Shouts erupted from the main chamber. "Someone's here! Check the hall!" In seconds, the entire warehouse erupted into frantic movement. Caleb returned fire, not to harm, but to suppress, to mislead, to maneuver. He aimed for the metal frames, the crates, the concrete floor, anywhere that would send ricochets bouncing loud enough to confuse Oliver's men and slow their reaction. The guard in the hall ducked back, startled. "It's the cop!" he shouted. He's in the tunnel side! Caleb breathed hard through the cold air. He had been seen, but Tommy was still alive. That was all that mattered. Voices rose in panic. The guard nearest Tommy jerked in surprise, turning toward the noise. And Oliver Drake, who had been somewhere deeper in the warehouse, suddenly appeared at the far doorway. Tall, broad-shouldered, his winter coat wrapped tight, Oliver looked both furious and startled. His dark eyes landed instantly on Tommy. "We're moving! Now!" Before Caleb could reposition, Oliver lunged across the room and yanked Tommy's chair backward, untying him quickly but roughly. The boy stumbled as Oliver pulled him toward the warehouse's side exit, the one that opened toward the slope above Snowfall Lake. "Move!" Oliver hissed. "We're not losing everything tonight." Caleb's pulse slammed. "Ranger, go!" The dog darted through the hall, swift and precise, weaving between crates, bypassing the guards who were still reacting to the sudden chaos. Caleb followed close behind, hugging the shadows, avoiding direct lines of fire as the guards scrambled. The warehouse's side door slammed open with a blast of cold wind. Snow swept inside in a white rush. Oliver dragged Tommy up the small incline leading toward the ridge. Behind them, the storm had thickened again, flinging icy crystals through the air that sparkled like shattered glass. Ranger burst out of the warehouse second, nose to the ground, catching Tommy's scent instantly. Caleb followed, boots slipping slightly on the rush snow. The slope above Snowfall Lake was steep, sculpted by frozen gusts into uneven ridges and soft pockets hidden beneath the surface. Trees clustered at odd angles, their branches high and bare, creaking with the weight of frost. Oliver was moving uphill, toward terrain he believed would confuse Ranger, terrain where snow drifted unpredictably. But Oliver underestimated the dog's instincts. Ranger lifted his nose, caught the shifting wind, and charged forward, cutting diagonally across the hill in a path only he understood. He was not chasing footprints. He was chasing scent, fear, breath. The living trail Tommy left behind like a thin ribbon through the storm. Caleb climbed after him, boots plunging deep into the snow. The wind pushed at his back, urging him onward. The world had narrowed to three things: Ranger ahead, Oliver and Tommy silhouetted near the ridge, and the rising urgency pounding through Caleb's veins. Oliver reached the crest first. He turned, breathing hard, and raised his weapon, not aiming at Caleb, but firing warning shots into the air. The sound cracked across the mountainside, echoing sharp and cold. "Stay back!" he shouted, voice frayed by anger and fear. "You don't know what you're walking into, officer." Caleb stopped only long enough to catch his breath. "Let the boy—" "Go, Oliver!" he called. "This isn't the way out, not tonight." Oliver barked a bitter laugh. "You think I care what night it is? I'm done letting this town choke the life out of people like me." His grip tightened on Tommy's jacket. "He gets me what his father owed, nothing more." Tommy stumbled on the uneven snow, nearly falling. Oliver jerked him upright. Ranger growled from several yards away, low and dangerous, but Caleb signaled him to hold. They needed the right moment. The slope beneath Oliver shimmered with fresh snow, soft and deceptively smooth. Every winter, locals called this place the Powder Shelf, a layer of snow that hid pockets of air and loose ground underneath. One wrong step could bury a grown man waist deep. Oliver took that wrong step. As he pulled Tommy farther, his foot punched through the soft layer. He gasped and shifted his weight sharply to the left, straight onto another pocket of unstable snow. His balance faltered. Caleb saw the moment his center of gravity tipped, saw Oliver's hand loosen on Tommy's jacket, saw his boot slide, and then Oliver fell. He didn't fall far, just down a small natural dip in the ridge, cushioned by soft snow. But the fall knocked the weapon from his hand and wind from his chest. Caleb lunged forward before Oliver could recover, sliding downhill and grabbing Oliver's arm, pinning him with practiced efficiency. The snow muffled everything, the scuffle, the grunts, even Oliver's curses. Caleb secured him swiftly, breath fogging in the freezing air. "It's over," Caleb said quietly. Behind him, Tommy stood trembling but unharmed at the ridge's edge. Ranger reached the boy first, pressing against him protectively. Tommy wrapped his small arms around the dog's neck, burying his face into Ranger's fur. Caleb felt something inside his chest loosen, But the night had one more blade of danger waiting. A shout rang out. One of Oliver's men had followed them up the slope, and as he saw Oliver pinned, he rushed forward, quick, reckless. Ranger spun, positioning himself between the man and Tommy. The man swung an arm to shove the dog aside, but Ranger intercepted, knocking him off balance. The man stumbled, regained footing, and swung again, catching Ranger along the shoulder. Ranger yelped, but held his ground. Caleb surged upward, closing the distance in seconds. He restrained the man, pulling him away from Ranger with a force sharpened by adrenaline. The man fell into the snow, winded but unharmed, and offered no further fight. Ranger limped a step, shaking out his injured shoulder. It wasn't serious. Caleb saw that instantly. Relief washed through him. The storm eased once more as if exhaling. The ridge stood quiet again. Tommy hurried toward Caleb, voice breaking. "You came for me. You really came?" Caleb knelt, resting a gloved hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Always." Ranger pressed against them, tail flicking despite the pain. In the quiet of that cold night, among drifting flakes that sparkled like faint stars, the danger finally broke, and the rescue was complete. Dawn crept slowly over Silver Ridge, slipping like pale gold between the peaks, softening the sharp edges of the night that had nearly stolen everything. The storm had blown itself into exhaustion, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost sacred, snow blanketing the world in gentle folds, icicles glittering like strings of crystal prayer beads beneath the warming sky. The mountains, long hidden behind blinding veils of white, now emerged in quiet majesty, as if bowing to the soft light returning to the valley. Caleb Ward walked through that awakening world, his breath forming faint clouds in the morning air, Tommy clinging to his side, with one small hand gripping his jacket. Ranger limped beside them, but held his head high, tail flicking in slow, steady arcs. Behind them, officers from Silver Ridge, who had finally reached the site after the storm weakened, escorted Oliver Drake and his remaining accomplice down the trail. Their wrists were bound, their expressions a mix of defeat and disbelief, as though winter itself had turned against them. Tommy glanced back only once. Then he looked up at Caleb. "Am I really going home?" Caleb placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "Yes, Tommy, you're going home." As they approached the trailhead where police vehicles waited, a figure broke through the cluster of officers and ran forward, boots slipping on the icy ground. Sienna Moore reached her son with a cry that cracked the cold morning open like a fragile shell. She dropped to her knees, pulling Tommy into her arms, her entire body trembling as though thawing for the first time in weeks. "My baby." "Oh, Tommy," she whispered, holding him tight, pressing her forehead to his. Tears mingled with melting snow on her cheeks, shining in the new light. Tommy clutched her coat, burying his face against her. "Mom, I wasn't scared all the time. Just sometimes." Sienna kissed the top of his head. "You were so brave, so brave." Caleb stepped back respectfully, watching the reunion unfold with a quiet sense of completeness. Snowflakes drifted lazily around them, catching in Sienna's hair, turning the moment into something tender and timeless, like a scene carved into the heart of winter itself. Beside him, Ranger sat down carefully, favoring his injured shoulder. The wound wasn't severe, but the adrenaline of the night had worn off, and he leaned gently against Caleb's leg. "You did good, boy," Caleb murmured, kneeling to run his hand through Ranger's thick fur. The German shepherd gave a soft huff, leaning into the touch, eyes half closed. Paramedics approached shortly, giving Ranger a quick assessment. "Mild muscle strain," one said. "Nothing serious. He just needs rest." Caleb nodded, relief loosening the tension still gripping his shoulders. Ranger had been his partner through countless calls, but this one had carved deeper than most. Seeing him hurt, even slightly, felt like seeing the world tilt a little off balance. Once Tommy was safe in his mother's arms and Ranger was cleared for treatment, the officers began loading Oliver and his man into patrol vehicles. Oliver's dark eyes locked on Caleb for a moment, an old grudge flaring like embers, refusing to die. "You always think you've won," Oliver muttered, voice low but clear in the crisp air. Caleb met his stare without blinking. "This wasn't about winning," he said. "This was about protecting a child, something you forgot how to do a long time ago." The car door shut, ending Oliver's defiance. Snow settled quietly on the window as the convoy prepared to leave. For the first time in years, the shadows Oliver had cast over the town seemed to lift, carried away like smoke dissolving into the cold morning wind. Back in town, the news spread faster than melting snow. People opened their doors, stepped onto porches, and looked toward the mountains with awe and gratitude. Silver Ridge had always been a place shaped by storms, but this storm had nearly taken a child and had instead revealed the strength of those who protected it. The police station warmed with life as officers returned. Sienna and Tommy stayed for statements, but the atmosphere held none of the earlier panic. Instead, there was relief woven into every voice that passed through the room. While an officer took notes, Tommy leaned against his mother's side, fingers loosely tangled with hers, as if afraid letting go might make the nightmare return. But Sienna stroked his hair, whispering reassurances that settled his trembling heart. Ranger lay on a padded mat in the corner, resting comfortably after being treated. His eyes followed every movement Caleb made, loyal even in recovery. Caleb knelt beside him, checking his bandage. "You'll be back chasing tennis balls by tomorrow," he joked softly. Ranger thumped his tail in approval. Later that afternoon, as sunlight warmed the icicles into dripping beads, the town gathered near the central square, an area framed by old brick shops with snow-dusted roofs. The mayor stood on the wooden platform, her breath fogging as she addressed the growing crowd. Children leaned against their parents, shopkeepers closed early to attend, and elders bundled in wool blankets watched with solemn pride. "We live in a town where winter can humble even the strongest," the mayor said. "But today, we're reminded that courage walks among us." Her voice carried across the crowd, cutting through the crisp air. Officer Caleb Ward and Canine Ranger risked everything to bring a child home in the heart of a storm. For that, Silver Ridge thanks them. Caleb stepped forward, Ranger at his side, the dog limping only slightly. Applause rose like a breaking wave, warm, thunderous, echoing off the mountains. It was the kind of sound that could thaw frost, chase shadows, and fill a heart long used to solitude. Caleb bowed his head modestly. He never enjoyed being in the spotlight, but the gratitude in the townspeople's eyes felt honest, earned. Ranger barked once, a startled but proud sound, earning laughter and cheers. Sienna and Tommy stood at the front of the crowd. Tommy clapped enthusiastically, his smile bright and whole again. Sienna's eyes glistened as she mouthed a simple thank you toward Caleb. A thank you that carried the weight of a life returned, a future restored. As the ceremony ended and people drifted home, the thaw of early spring whispered its arrival through small details, melting snow trickling through gutters, sunlight dripping warm gold across rooftops, breezes losing their bite. Silver Ridge, once buried in white, began to reveal its colors again. 1 week after the rescue, Sienna and Tommy moved into a new rental across town, a brighter place, closer to school, with windows that caught morning light. Tommy helped unpack boxes, pausing occasionally to look out the window toward the mountains. He seemed lighter now, as if shedding a shadow he carried far too young. Sienna watched him with silent gratitude each time he smiled to himself. Caleb visited once with Ranger, now fully recovered, to check on them. Tommy ran outside when he heard Ranger bark, throwing his arms around the dog, who responded with a joyful lick across the boy's cheek. Sienna laughed softly, the sound warm and alive. "I think he missed you both," she said. Caleb smiled. "We're just glad you're safe." As he and Ranger walked back toward the truck, sunlight stretched long across the quiet street. The world felt restored, not perfect, but whole enough to breathe again. Winter had taken its toll, but spring was coming, and in Silver Ridge, light always followed the storm. Sometimes God's miracles do not arrive with thunder or bright flashes of light. Sometimes they come quietly through the courage of ordinary people, the loyalty of a faithful dog, or the strength a mother finds when she refuses to give up. In our everyday lives, we face storms of our own, moments when the path is hidden and the future feels uncertain. But just as the snow cleared for Sienna and Tommy, God can open a way for us too, often through kindness we did not expect, and help we did not see coming. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment to tell us your thoughts, and remember to subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and love. May God bless you and your family, and if you believe in the quiet miracles He sends, type Amen in the comments.